Well, this'll be a nightmare.
Yes, it will, Lacey. Yes, it will. What are we talking about today?
How many genders there are.
Oh, good. Now, I will ostensibly be responding to that Lacey Green video I just played a couple of clips from, not because her answer is too far off base, it seems to eventually boil down to 2, but she leaves so much wiggle room and makes the concept so blurry that I thought it would be worth my time tightening things up and bringing them into focus a little. So I say I'll just ostensibly be responding to her because I won't be using her whole video, and I'll instead be focusing on the central question, which is, of course, how many genders could there be? Is there one? Are there two? Are there 153? Stupid song for a stupid question. Actually, I say it's a stupid question, but given that terms like gender identity are starting to show up in laws in various places, looking at you, Canada, it's probably a good idea if we at least know what gender is. So I've decided to use the biggest source of confusion that I can find on the issue. Hi, Lacey. By the way, part of the reason I won't be responding to the whole video is that Lacey spends the first part of it simply responding to her fellow feminists, apologizing for not saying there are as many genders as you feel in your heart. She does this apology through meaningless platitudes such as the following.
The idea here is not to invalidate anyone's identity, anyone's experience of gender.
Simply a void of a sentence, I think you'll agree. But once she's done with that, she does say that she's open to having her mind changed.
I'm open to other perspectives. I'm open to changing my mind on this stuff. I have before, but I need strong arguments.
Which is great. It's what I'm trying to do here anyway. If anyone knows Lacey and thinks my points are worthwhile, feel free to send it her way. Anywho, Lacey kicks off the meat of the video by not talking about gender, but about sex. Now, these two words sometimes refer to different concepts, but I'll get into that later on. Let's first take a look at how Lacey defines sex.
This is a penis and this is a vulva. In biology class, or maybe porn, we all learned that genitals are a part of human sexuality, in large part because they help us to reproduce.
Did you catch that? Why, again, are genitals part of human sexuality?
In large part because they help us to reproduce.
In large part. No, I'm not making a pun, although large part. But seriously, genitals are considered part of human sexuality entirely because they help us reproduce. If genitals could not help us reproduce, they would not be considered part of human sexuality. Whereas, if you change anything else about them, their weight, colour, size, shape, taste, whatever, but they remain the thing we use to have sex, then they remain part of human sexuality. This may seem like nitpicking, but it's important to understand that sex is about reproduction. Or, to put it a little bit glibly, sex is about sex. Oh, by the way, this definition here, either of the two main categories, male and female, into which humans and most other living things are divided on the basis of their reproductive functions, this is just the definition from Google's dictionary, and you know what? While I'm not always impressed with the default Google search definition on words, I think this one's pretty good. Sex is really quite a simple distinction. Which sex you are is defined fundamentally by which role you play in reproduction. You need two participants to make a baby, impregnator and impregnatee. Two sexual participants. Therefore, there are two sexes. If you think you've identified a third, please tell me what role, other than impregnator or impregnatee, that third sex plays in sexual reproduction. Now, Lacey doesn't seem to disagree with the claim that there are two sexes, but she sure does hedge it a lot. Observe.
There are basically two sets of equipment that allow humans to reproduce. That is male and female. XY and XX. That is basically sex. Basically.
Basically. That's about to be followed up with some additional characteristics and some perceived exceptions, which frankly aren't either of those things. But before I move on to that, let's focus for a moment on the claim that sex is basically about whether you have a penis or a vagina. Because it really isn't. I mean, for all intents and purposes, it basically is. But if we're going to be autistically pedantic about it for a second, which I think we should, then it's missing a step. Your genitals enable you to either be impregnated or to impregnate. And that is what defines your sex, ultimately. If you're a woman, fertile womb and all, you can be impregnated, but you have something that looks more like a penis than a vagina due to some kind of deformity, then you're still a woman. The reason that I point this out is that I don't want to get anyone into the idea that it's the shape of your genitals that determines your sex, rather than the function. This holds true no matter how many traits you bring up that are correlated with your sex.
A more comprehensive account of biological sex includes 4 traits. You've got chromosomes, hormones, primary sex characteristics, and secondary sex characteristics.
Right. Again, these things are all related to your sex, but they are not your sex. If you have certain chromosomes, you will produce certain hormones, develop certain genitals, and have other certain characteristics which will result in you either being an impregnator or an impregnatee. But it's that last part, the reproductive function, which is ultimately what defines sex. And once again, there are 2 reproductive functions. All right, let's move on to your perceived exceptions.
And there's a little variation here, right? Low key. I mean, you got, females that are infertile, you've got males that have more boobage, all that kind of stuff.
Okay, so I've pretty much already dealt with the male boobage example. There are some characteristics, such as boobage, which are related to your sex, but are not your sex. But what about the other example, the infertile female? Doesn't that throw a spanner in the works for the simple reproduction-based definition that I've been using so far? Well, no, this is an edited video. I wouldn't have kept that definition in if it did. You see, language already has a standard mechanism by which we deal with that kind of situation. You see, we'll take that thing and consider what category it would fall into if it did not have the deviation in question. So, let's say, for example, that we define a bird by its wings. Not saying you do, just you could. And then we see a bird that has had one of its wings pulled off. Well, would we still call it a bird? Yes, we'd just say it's an amputee bird. Well, what about this shitty Honda Fit? We might define it by its function, the way sex is defined. And its function might be driving on its 4 wheels to the liquor shop for me. Now, what if you pull its wheels off? Doesn't that stop it from being a shitty Honda Fit? No, it just becomes an even shittier Honda Fit. Which, by the way, I forgot to invite you all to today. So, yes, Danny Duchamp, welcome to previously aforementioned poor quality automobile. Where was I? Oh yes, bird. So what if that bird was born with a missing wing? Would we still consider it a bird? Yes, just because it was born that way doesn't stop it from being a deformity. So we just simply say it is a deformed bird, which is a pretty reasonable description of an infertile female. I mean, you might want to say that it isn't a deformity. You might want to say that the ability to fuck like crazy and never get pregnant is more of a superpower. But however you want to say it, the principle remains the same. We consider which sex you would be minus that deformity or superpower. Once you understand that, the exceptions don't seem like such a big deal anymore. Anyway, let's go through a couple more of your examples.
Then you also have, about 1 in 2,000 people are intersex. They have both male and female bits.
They do! Which is another good reason not to define sex by bits, but by function. Intersex people have deformities, but they're still either impregnators or impregnatees, or more likely than neither, but minus one of their deformities, they would be impregnators or impregnatees. No intersex person can perform both functions, and all of them would be able to perform one of those functions if they didn't have the deformities. So, what else you got?
And another part of the variation is trans folks, who will transition between male and female using hormones and surgery.
No, they won't. Transsexuals are amputee birds. They are still their original sex unless you come up with a method of changing their reproductive function, and as far as I know, no methods currently achieve that. Notice that this is a nice, simple concept. And more than being simple, it's indispensably useful as a concept. And biologists, for this reason, will often define sex by gamete sizes. If you produce small gametes, then those gametes can fertilize the larger gametes produced by the opposite sex. Thus, if you're producing small gametes, you're male, large gametes, you're female. But you don't even need to know any biology for this to make sense. You can just look at the simple distinction between impregnator and impregnatee that I mentioned before. Hell, if aliens came down to Earth and had no concept of our biology, but wanted to study life here, the bifurcation of human sexuality would be undoubtedly one of the first things that they would notice. You see, the fundamental aspect of life is that it reproduces. And as far as humans are concerned at least, the way that we do that is via two very distinct components, and each individual can perform only one of those components. This means that as far as human sexuality goes, humans come in two distinct types. If the word sex is not what you use to refer to the two reproductive functions of humans, what is? Anywho, hopefully at this point, I've driven home that there aren't basically two sexes. There are actually two sexes. But that's just biological sex. We still have to address gender, which is the main point of the discussion, I think. So, Lacey, what is gender?
Gender is the way that body sex is interpreted and understood in the world, in society. The American Psychological Association defines gender as the attitudes, feelings, and behaviors that a given culture associates with a person's biological sex. And this is the definition that is, widely used by experts.
It is? Because the definition you showed is from a psychological association. Gender is not just a term used in psychology. Biologists, for example, use the term, and as biology is a more foundational science than psychology, it's not usual for biologists to take their cues from psychologists. In a paper by David Haig called The Inexorable Rise of Gender and the Decline of Sex, Social Change in Academic Titles 1945 to 2001, Haig observes that before 1955, the term gender wasn't really used, except in the sense of a grammatical category. As you can see in definition 2 on screen now, that's an entirely unrelated concept. Then, after 1955, the term gender became more prevalent, but it is only used as a term distinct from biological sex, sometimes in some fields. Or, as Haig puts it, a sex-gender distinction is now only fitfully observed. In all fairness, Lacey, I know you go on to acknowledge that some people mean different things by gender, but I wanted to call you out for trying to lend additional legitimacy to the American Psychological Association's definition. That being said, I do understand that it can be useful for psychologists to make a distinction between biological sex and the psychological aspects, such as attitudes, feelings, and behaviors that often come along with being a member of a certain sex. I think they're missing an important chunk of the utility by restricting it to just the cultural associations, but oh well. Let's carry on with this definition.
When you look at the definition, it's kind of broad and subjective. Attitudes, feelings, behaviors, what does that even mean?
Well, given a specific situation, your attitude is how you think about that situation, your feelings are how your emotions respond to that situation, and your behavior is how you act in that situation. Given a specific culture, there are certain attitudes, feelings, and behaviors that culture associates with being one of the two biological sexes. For example, a culture may include the expectation that when being attacked, a man is more likely to fight, while a woman is more likely to cry for help. This might be based on biology to some extent, and it may be socially constructed to some extent, but it's still fundamentally dual in nature. I suspect your whole "what does it even mean" comment was obscurantism, frankly, done so that you can weasel out of outright saying there are two genders. Not that I think you're intentionally lying, just that you might be uncomfortable with looking at the truth here, so you instinctively try to muddy the waters. Anyway, I said I'd acknowledge that you acknowledge that many people mean many different things by gender. So let's go through the different conceptions of gender that you touch on, and see how many genders there will be by each of those standards.
One of the problems in this conversation is that the same word is being used to refer to a million things. Gender sometimes refers to sex. How many genders? Basically 2.
No, not basically 2, clearly 2. This is because gender, by all of the other definitions you're going to mention, is based on sex. So we need a clear definition of the former so that we can understand the latter.
Gender sometimes refers to society's gender roles. How many? Basically 2.
Okay, again, not basically 2, clearly 2. This one is essentially the same as the American Psychological Association definition that you presented before, and it clearly points to there being just 2 genders. If one's gender is the societal expectations of one's sex, then if a set of societal expectations is to be called a gender, it must pertain to a sex. Since there are only 2 sexes, there are only 2 sets of societal expectations that can aptly be called a gender. Okay, so let's look at one example in isolation. just to keep things simple, let's say that a culture includes an expectation that girls wear pink and boys wear blue. This would be part of the sex roles definition of gender that you proposed here. But then let's say that it's acceptable for some boys and some girls to wear green. Is this now a third gender? No. If it was, there would need to be a third sex with which this gender is associated. It just means that the societal expectations of what one is to wear is not always determined by one's gender. It's just some other, potentially not even related, social expectation.
Gender sometimes refers to someone's outward gender expression. How many? Potentially infinite.
What?
How many? Potentially infinite.
No. Okay. It was hard enough to rein in the mocking when you were just saying trans people change their sex and not just their gender, as distinct from sex. But this really makes things difficult. Okay. Let's put that definition back up on screen for a moment. This definition is terrible and useless. Can you see why? Right, because you use the word gendered in your definition of gender. You don't just include all self-expression, and fair enough, because calling all self-expression gender would also make the term terrible and useless. It would fall into the trap of describing nothing by describing everything. But when presenting a caveat to determine which types of self-expression are a facet of gender and which aren't, you simply say, oh, it's only the gendered ones that are part of gender. Helpful. This is a mistake that you avoided making with your previous definition. You didn't say gender roles, you said sex roles, because saying gender roles would make the definition recursive and stupid. But with this definition, you made no such effort to avoid recursion. The reason, I can only assume, is that you noticed that if you say a sex expression, then it refers to forms of self-expression, including voice, dress, and mannerism, as they pertain to your sex. Then you'd be forced to admit that there must only be two genders by this definition as well. And that'd be no good, because you've already said that there are only two genders by the previous two definitions, and you're trying to straddle the boundary between postmodernist ideologue and not a postmodernist ideologue. But I'm afraid trying to come down on two sides of a true dichotomy is just not going to work. It's just going to make it more apparent which side of it you're on. So, X or not X, pick one. Next definition, please.
Gender sometimes refers to individual gender identities. How many? Potentially infinite.
Well, this one's simple. You said the personal experience of one's own sex and gender. Well, the experience of gender has the same recursion mistake like the previous one, and the experience of sex means that there are only two genders because there are only two sexes for you to have an experience of.
Gender sometimes refers to labels and pronouns. It's language. How many? Again, potentially infinite.
Recursion mistake again. The definition of gender can't be gendered language. It can't be language used to describe one's gender to others, because then what you're saying is language to describe one's language to describe one's language to describe one's ad infinitum to others. I get the distinct feeling that you're attempting to pad out your list.
Okay, so the word gender can mean a lot of things in this conversation.
Yeah, although it can't mean as many things as you seem to think it can.
Question now is, well, which one of these definitions of gender do we use when we're talking about things like sexism or transphobia, feminism, anti-feminism, gender differences in society?
Well, I'm not going to outright say one definition that you should use. I won't be presumptuous enough to say that I know every single valid use of those two syllables, but I will explain some that you probably shouldn't use. Whether it's because they're recursive or because they explain nothing by explaining everything. For example, if you wanted to talk about gender differences in society, you shouldn't use a definition of gender that encapsulates all gender differences in society. Because if you do, then every statement you make about gender is going to simply be a tautology. Gender equals gender. Let me explain this a little more clearly. If you want to ask whether cats or dogs are larger on average and why, your definition of cat and your definition of dog should not include their size. If part of the definition of cat is that it's small, then any large cat will be classed as a dog or neither, and you may as well have asked if cats are cats and why. This is useless. The definition of the terms in question cannot include the factor you're interested in learning about if you want to say anything useful. Furthermore, if your definition of cat and your definition of dog covers every difference between cats and dogs, you'll find yourself unable to say anything useful on the topic at all. This is why I think one good way to define gender is simply as a synonym for sex. Many people would say that this is determined by chromosomes, XX or XY, but while this is certainly the cause of your gender, by this definition anyway. It's really the reproductive function that defines your gender. If you define gender in this way, then you can compare males and females and do various analyses on the differences we tend to find between them. A difference in earnings, for example, can be looked at, and you can see to what extent the different earnings of men and women is determined by biology and to what extent it's some sociological explanation. This only works, by the way, because the biological definition doesn't imply that all the differences we see between the genders are caused by biology. Only that biology is what defines the genders.
So I asked those of you who feel like there's only two genders to share why. And 53% of you told me there's only two genders because of biology. You know, there's male, female, XY, XX, and it's not a complicated issue. This is fairly straightforward, and so on and so forth. Logically, you know, let's walk through this. In its purest interpretation, gender equals biology implies that all of the differences that we see between men and women in society are ultimately the product of our bodies.
I'm beginning to think you don't know what a definition is. Moving on.
How do we account for cultures where the gender roles are completely swapped?
We account for it by saying that those societies have swapped the roles genders must perform, not by saying that they have swapped genders. Even if I accept as gospel that they really have completely swapped their gender roles in these societies, those men on screen are still men. Their society expects of their gender things which our society might expect of the other gender, but that says nothing about which gender they are.
How do we account for cultures where there are 3, 4, even 5 genders?
We don't account for them, because they in fact don't have additional sexes or genders. First of all, the sexes. These cultures don't have additional biological components for reproduction. They still have one group which produces sex cells that can fertilize the sex cells of the other group, and that's it. Their other quote-unquote sex is intersex, which is, as I pointed out before, either a male or a female who has some kind of deformity. As for their so-called 5 genders, only 2 of them, male and female, are genders. Despite the weird language you'll find on sources that talk about them, they're just different varieties of trans people. Calabai is a man who acts like, and attempts to look like, and is generally treated like, a woman. A male to female tranny, in other words. Kalalai is a woman who acts like, attempts to look like, and is generally treated like a man. A female to male tranny, in other words. And a bisu is just a man or a woman who tries to be as androgynous as possible. To call these additional genders is silliness. Even if we define gender the way psychologists do, as a collection of traits associated with a given sex, trans is still not an extra gender because there's no extra sex with which those traits are associated.
I mean, I'm not just making this stuff up.
You might not be, but someone sure did. Anyway, I'll throw one more clip from your video in before we call this topic done.
So the next question then is, well, how much of our gender differences are biological versus social? You know, to what degree does each play a role? And I think that that is the interesting question.
You're right. That is an interesting question. The human population is bisected fundamentally by the 2 sexual components involved in reproduction. These 2 groups seem to display a lot of consistent variation, and asking to what extent these correlations with one's sex are determined by one's sex is really quite interesting and worth asking. But we're never going to get the answer by playing obscurantist games with the definitions. So, to briefly sum up, your sex is determined by the function you play in reproduction. And your gender is either a synonym for that, or it's correlated with one of those 2 sexes. Either way, there's 2 genders. Or, to sum it up, as succinctly as I possibly can, how many genders could there be? Is there 1? Are there 2? Are there 163? There are 2. Who watches me? Oh, holy fuck.